I probably brought this up to call what Graham is presenting or sharing. I would even like to call this the Graham lectures or something, which sounds very big, you know, because I think that within the context of what we are doing with you, what you are requesting us to do, kind of training, capacity development on all different aspects, that's kind of our standard work, so to say. But I think it's a little bit of a highlight to have someone as experienced as Graham here. And as far as this is already the second time we are doing this, that brought me to the idea of calling this kind of a lecture series, which I think I know Graham doesn't like. He is too modest for this. But yes, I would like to leave it with that. It's very good to see that so many of you have come, that so many of you find this worth spending their time for. And I'm looking forward to two very interesting hours and the active response we have seen from your side last time. I was really impressed. This is also what we have told Natalia Starosenko of the EU delegation. This is not only a very valuable input, it's also a very interesting discussion. So if something similar could happen today, I think that would be super, very good. Thank you. Do you want to say very few words before we give the floor to Graham then?
Sure, with pleasure. Dear Matthias, thank you very much for invitation, and hello, dear colleagues. And I think it's a very big pleasure to welcome Mr. Meadows on behalf of the EU delegation, and I think it will be extremely beneficial for us to listen to such a high-level person who has hands-on experience. No, but I really think so, because I've been in DG Regio in Brussels, and I saw that huge building, and that person managed people who are sitting there at some point. So indeed, this is a great pleasure to listen to you. From the point of view of our work at the delegation, I think for me it will be very interesting to listen to the discussion, because we are planning the second phase of ULEAD program, and indeed we need to support regional development. However, regional development is a very huge topic, and we need to prioritize, and we need to understand the areas of growth. And I hope that brainstorming with you, discussion with you, will help us also to understand what we can support, because we cannot support everything. But at the same time, we need to prioritize, we need to understand the areas where we will really want to work, and then include it respectively in our assistance for the next 3 years. So I also brought my notebook. I am prepared to take notes, and I will listen to you, and your opinion as Ukrainian civil servants is extremely important. So I wish you a very productive event, and thank you very much for invitation.
You're both very kind. It's not modesty on my part which says we shouldn't call this a lecture or whatever, okay? I consider myself to be, as it were, on the same level as you. That's to say, people who try to actually implement or design and implement policy, and try to bring about the sort of changes which we want to achieve for the living quality of citizens, either in the European Union in my case, or in Ukraine in your case. And so for me it's more of a conversation between people who engaged in a common activity. The mere fact that it's a conversation means you have to take part, as Matthias has tried to say politely, and as Natalia has tried to say politely. I mean, you have to. So you can interrupt me. If this was a lecture, of course, I would start off, and 2 hours later I would stop. But you can interrupt at any point if you feel that you don't understand what I'm talking about, or if you feel that, well, what I'm saying is perfectly stupid, quite probably, or not suited to Ukraine. So what I thought we would do, if we may, is to start off from the idea that any policy, regional and local development policy, but any policy, is divided into two parts, if you think about it. There's the sort of knowledge part, which is the piece that, as it were, provides the background to the policy and provides the justification for what you try to do. And there's the technical part, which tries to actually bring this knowledge to bear on problems on the ground in a way that will help people to see benefits. Let me give you an example, because I can see. So if you think about health policy, or you think about health policy for a minute, there's a knowledge about medicine and about disease. If you think about education policy, there's all of the learning that you want to transmit to pupils. If you think about regional and economic development, regional and local development, there are all of the things you know about what stimulates development, innovation, invention, blah, 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 all that stuff. And then in each of these policies, there's another piece, which I want to call this afternoon the delivery mechanism, which actually takes this knowledge and makes instruments and sets targets and objectives and tries to deliver benefits to the citizen. So if we take, and if we think about this delivery mechanism, we can see that whether we're talking about health policy, or whether we're talking about education policy, or whether we're talking about local and regional development, there are certain similarities in the delivery system. There are certain lessons which apply to all policies. So we can learn, as administrators, the things that we can learn from other policies, and when our career sends us to another policy area, the knowledge that we have is of use in these other policy areas. Okay? So, I would like us to talk about the delivery of policy, which is that part of the policy which takes the knowledge that we have about economic and regional and local economic development and transmits that through instruments to try to change things on the ground. And I'd like us to challenge two ideas which are quite widespread. First of all, I would like to argue against the idea that policy is the business of government alone. And second, I would like us to argue against the idea that policy making and policy implementation are different things. I would like to try to convince you, or you to convince me of the opposite, that policy is the business of citizens, and that government is the agent of citizens. And I would like to try to convince you that policy is a single phenomenon, even though I've already talked about it being composed of two parts. It's a single phenomenon. So I would like us to try to discuss these two ideas, that policy is the business of citizens, and that policy begins and ends with citizens' needs and citizens' benefits. The reason we have a policy is that citizens have needs, and the reason we stop policy is that we've delivered the benefits that they wanted. Now, policy is rather messy, but for the purposes of, because it's messy because we don't often get a piece of blank paper for making policy, where normally we go into a set of circumstances where policy is already operating, where we're just taking over from someone else, where someone wants to perhaps change an existing policy. We're always operating within a preset set of circumstances, and this makes things rather messy. But I want to try to present it like this for the moment. Here we have what I've just said, which is that we have the citizens, we have the citizens' needs, we have they are transmitted somehow into policy, and they come back to the citizens as benefits. And in order that we can try to understand what goes on there, we can actually break down policy into particular tasks, like the recognition of the need. That's something which is normally provided by the politician as opposed to the civil servant. The formulation of the need into instruments, which is normally carried out by the civil servant, although there's an ideological input from the politician. The politician may say, I don't like to interfere in what goes on, I prefer the market to do this. I don't like, somebody may say, I don't like regulations, I prefer the market, and so on. And then there's implementation, which we're talking about, and then there's evaluation to try to make. All of these things I'm going to talk about in a very superficial way, because you will help me to go further. Now, it sounds rather theoretical, but it has practical consequences in my view, certainly for the EU, one of which I'll talk about in a minute, and I imagine it also has consequences for Ukraine. But my view is that if we can keep this in our mind, that policy is for citizens, responding to citizens' needs and delivering them the benefits. It helps us to find a better, more responsive policy. Now let's think about these two ideas. Now you may disagree. There's a problem with language perhaps in this, but the first common idea, which is quite deep-rooted, is that policy somehow belongs to government. Okay? That it's the business of the government. And the reason for this is that quite clearly the policy has to balance a number of factors, many of which are beyond the citizen's knowledge. Not because the citizen is incapable of understanding these things, but simply because it's the government's job to balance the budget and manage the finances, keep the state secure, and the government also operates according to a rhythm. So when there are elections coming, they want to do certain things. When the election's just taken place, they want to do certain things. There's a sort of rhythm to the way in which government operates. And also it's the government which brings to the table the wishes of the citizens and sets, as I said, the ideological frame in which the policy will be created. So yes, the government is an essential actor in policy. But we go from that realization that the government is essential to very quickly to another realization, which is that policy is for government. It's about government. We suffer a divorce between the citizens and between the idea, somewhere in this circuit, it seems so simple, we suffer a divorce. And instead of recognizing citizens' needs and delivering benefits, we get sidetracked. And I can find a number of reasons why this takes place. The first is that policy is formulated in an abstract world. I mean, it's the world of thought. And it's applied in the real world, which is a world of discomfort, okay? We have greater control in the abstract world than we do in the real world. And when you can see this difference in the language we use, all of us, when we talk about policy. So we talk about the centre. Okay, that's the place of knowledge, of wisdom, of ideas, the central government. The place where things are created. And then we talk about where we go with we operate the policy on the ground. And on the ground is another country. Because we define it as being almost backward, because by definition it has needs. So policy is designed at the centre by thinkers, people like us, and it's applied on the ground by doers who are operating some kind of a machine. And you can see, I mean, it's quite normal that in the capital we think that we're policy creators, we have knowledge, we have wisdom, we have ideas. And on the ground, where policy is implemented, it's routine, it's repetition, we do the same things all the time, it's automatic, it's not the same kind of activity. And slowly this has, in my view, a crippling effect sometimes on policy. I've reordered these, yeah, this is the slide I wanted. This seems to be an absolutely stupid case, but I'm telling you, it is extremely frequent, and I've encountered it even here in Ukraine, but it's fairly frequent in the European Union, I have to tell you. So we get this divorce between policy and implementation. So the needs have come down here, and benefits are being delivered, and implementation seems to be taking place. But it is not the implementation intended by the policymakers. It's sitting in the centre, this is what you wanted to do. You have an idea, you create the instruments. But something happens which means that, in fact, what you are trying to do is not being done. Benefits are still being delivered, but not by you, not by the policy. The classic case is programmes in the European Union which don't spend their money. So you allocate €1 billion to a programme to be spent over 3 years, and at the end of 2.5 years, out of the €1 billion, let's say 100 million has been spent. So the policy's gone on for 2/3 of its life with 1/10 of its money, and that means that the policy is not the policy that you're trying to operate is not the one which is being implemented. Instead, we have this strange phenomenon, which, in my view, is the policy civil service comfort zone. Okay? Now, where we have the recognition of need, we formulate instruments, we actually evaluate what we do, we use some of this data, which has nothing to do with what we've been doing, but we collect it and we use it. And then, because we're good, we change, we keep on a feedback loop, we keep improving this piece of equipment, if you want. Let me give you a couple of practical examples about how this works. From my own experience inside the European Union. We make a strategy. We apply the strategy. When we evaluate it, we find that the strategy is not being fulfilled. So we change the strategy. We just keep going around it. We make the strategy, not succeeding, we change the strategy. That's one frequent example. Another example. We set ourselves targets. We evaluate the targets are not being achieved. We change the targets. I've lived through this for years, where somebody coming in at the very beginning is filled with enthusiasm and says, I'd like to do 500, I'd like to make 500 jobs a month. We evaluate, and they've only created 100 jobs a month. What's the conclusion that we should draw? The conclusion we should draw is somehow it's not working. We have to change something. But the conclusion we draw is no, the target was wrong. We didn't set the target properly. The target should have been 100 jobs, not 500 jobs. So we get into this drama where the thing that we're trying to do is not what we're actually doing. Now, in the European Union, this is frequent and led us to develop, simply because you can imagine that with the distance between Brussels and the ground in Europe seems larger. This led us to develop a thing called multi-level governance, which is still not perfect, and I criticise that also. But you can understand that with 27 governments, which reflect differing ideologies, which have different time horizons with needs for elections, which where the capital, Rome or Paris, has had to cede power to Brussels, or where the ground is much more diverse. It's not one member state, it's 27 member states. You can imagine that in these circumstances, it becomes much easier to actually retreat into this than to worry about things outside. So, to try to stop that, we developed this system of multi-level governance, which, sorry, I've got, oh, yeah, there. I mean, this is an idiot picture, but you can see we have the European Union, we have member states, the regions and the local authorities, somewhere down here, the citizens. And so we don't only have one top level now, so top down, bottom up, this sort of, we've got different tops. It's a kind of decentralization. And it is our embodiment of this principle of subsidiarity. And it is better because it incorporates formal processes of consultation. There is some better knowledge up here of what's going on down there. But notice I haven't put an arrow in here because I don't want you to have the impression that the European Union is the fount of all perfect knowledge or anything of that sort, because it isn't. I mean, this creates other problems. Imagine that this is Kiev, and this is an oblast, and so on. This is an oblast, a rayon, and a hromada. You have an idea in Kiev, and you have a decentralized system. How are you going to make sure that this person does what you think he should do or she should do? How do you actually control? Now, because you've given up control. And the problem is that control, instruction, is much easier to do than persuasion and conviction. The army exists on instruction, orders. Imagine if the army existed on persuasion. Instead of me saying to Yuri, go out there and at the risk of being shot yourself, shoot those people. And he went, yes, certainly went. I had to say, Yuri, could we just talk about the geopolitical situation for Ukraine, which I think it would be a good idea if you, and he would say to me, well, I agree, but why don't you go? So, one of the problems we have is this. It's very, very difficult. Or not difficult, but it's given rise to all sorts of tensions. For a while, when we set this system up, the union tried to keep, let's say, some form of control. It tried to limit the amount of maneuverability that the other levels had. So, yes.
I think that the State Fund for Regional Development could be a good example of what you are talking about. And I would like to ask Yuri to kindly help me if I formulate something in the wrong way, because I'm only learning about this issue. Do you know the problems with the State Regional Development Fund?
Some.
Because if you allow, I will draw.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so we have this, це Державний фонд регіонального розвитку. Всі розуміють, про що я кажу, так? Because we are going from the EU side to work on this issue, and now we are thinking how we can do it. So if we could brainstorm today, that would be super important. State Fund for Regional Development. So it is administered by the Minregion, right? And users of this of the money from this fund are local authorities. So this is basically the scheme that you draw to us. But the State Fund for Regional Development should constitute 1% of the revenues of the state budget. And we did not pay 7 million euros in our regional development budget support last year. I managed that budget support. I know what I'm talking about. No, it was in 2017 because the revenues of this fund were less than 1%. And basically, the budget of this fund in 2018 was about 225 million euros. But 7 million was also a very nice amount of money that could be added to that fund. But the government could not reach that goal. And in 2018, this goal of 1% was not reached again. So now we're in the situation when the members of parliament even worse than this situation. So we have another player who should not be here, but they managed to worsen the situation with the fund because they amended the state budget law and the budget code of Ukraine, allowing members of parliament basically to control 50% of revenues of this fund, because now they can participate in selection panels. So it means that final beneficiaries will suffer even more. And in this situation, we are thinking how we can help from the EU side. And we were thinking about another player, which is the Accounting Chamber of Ukraine. This is our supreme audit institution. And the Accounting Chamber has in its work plan for the first quarter of 2019 the audit of efficiency of expenditures of the state fund. But the Accounting Chamber does not have any enforcement instruments. So they can just recommend, and they go here to the members of parliament because they work with the members of parliament. But it's basically more a lobby than something real. They cannot really push them. So in this situation, what can we do and how can we help to build all this vertical powers in order to make this fund transparent, in order to make this fund to reach 1% of state budget revenues, and how we can help our local authorities and citizens in the end to benefit from this fund. This is our dilemma now. And we would be extremely grateful to you if we brainstorm, if Graham, if you agree, because we are thinking in practice. This is our task now. This is what we are discussing at the delegation. What we can do, we can involve our management, we can involve the European Commission, because this is indeed a very important issue. And there was already a letter signed by the director of DG Regio and by the head of the support group for Ukraine about the state fund of regional development. So now we need to think not only about letters, but what can we do? With whom can we meet? How we can advocate for this?
Okay, can I? Yuri and I have talked about this to a certain extent. So, one, my experience is this. If you put on the table anywhere a large sum of money and you do not spend it, someone else will come and spend it for you, okay? So, this is one of those cases where you have to be very resilient to understand the difference between the good and the best. So my first point is there has to be, on the part of the local authorities and the citizens, a strict discipline in coming forward with projects. That's the first point. I don't know who decides the projects. The second point is, and this is where the best and the good bit comes in, there's always the tendency when you're deciding on spending money to say, well, I could buy this scheme which will create 100 jobs, but that's really not a very good scheme. If I wait, I'll get a better scheme. So we have something which is good, but no, we want the best. So this is only going to create 100 jobs, so we'll wait for one which will create, for the same amount of money, 150 jobs or something. And my view is that you cannot do that. You cannot do that, because the more you hesitate, the more these great monsters who have endless appetites for money, and they are mostly here, okay, in the parliament, the more these people will come forward. And you cannot ever win. Just remember this. For the rest of your careers, you can say, years and years ago, I met this idiot in Brussels. He was waving his arms about and so on. I can't remember anything he said, apart from one thing. He said that you can never keep money which you don't spend. Your job is to spend the money that you're allocated. And if you can't spend it on the best, then spend it on what you can, on the good. And if you can't spend it on the good, spend it on the average. But spend it, because if you don't spend it, it will be taken away from you, either by the budget authority, which will take it back, or some other person who will come and say, well, I've got an idea. And you'll say, what's your idea? He'll say, I've told you the last time we met, I had someone who wanted to make an internal ski slope. For economic development purposes, an internal ski slope. Can you imagine? And the problem is that the person who comes up with the idea is called Lord something. And he has a bunch of helpers, a huge lobby behind him. And you say, that's not a good idea. And, well, I know, but the money's here. And you say, well, I've got much better ideas than the ski slope. And then why don't you use it? So you have to spend the money. The second thing is that, and it follows on from the first, and this is also an argument or a discussion I've had with Yuri in the past. Because you can't keep people out, you cannot protect the sort of purity of the fund. You cannot do it. You have to go for a second best. And the second best is to make sure that anyone who spends money from the fund, whether it be for a parliamentarian or whatever, spends it according to your principles. I'll come to some of the principles a little bit later. But Sergei, Yuri and I had a problem some years ago that we were all parts. They were running, I was only a very small part of a project which was financed by the European Union with quite a small sum of money, about 5 million euros. And it was really properly organized. It was really beautifully organized. It was going to take, let's say, 4 years or something. So in the first year it spent 2.5 million. And in the next part, it's going to spend the remaining money. You remember? And everything was going well. And then the problem of internally displaced people began to be acute. And suddenly everybody wanted to do something for internally displaced people and said, well, where can we find some money? And the European Union delegation looked around, and there was our beautifully managed project with next year's money in this tin and the year after's money in this tin, and we were doing it. They said, well, we'll take that. And they took that money. We lost that money. Now, for several days we were suicidal, okay? Yuri was lying down in the street outside the Minregion building, hoping to be run over. And we slowly pulled ourselves together. We took the view then that if we could persuade the people who were running projects for internally displaced people to do them to fit them into regional programs, to fit them into the regional way of doing things, we were still getting something for ourselves. And the benefit is that if, first of all, we harness to a certain extent the parliamentarians, okay? The second thing is, the more frequently we push through our own bureaucratic machinery the projects, the more efficient our people become. And the more efficient they become, the more confident they become, and the more they then start to put things forward. So unless you've got very clear regulatory very clear rules which prevent certain things, you cannot prevent it. We had a rule, for example, which was that we would never pay for the maintenance of a project. So if people made a road, we would pay for the road, but when the road needed to be mended, we wouldn't pay to mend it. We did not pay for swimming pools. Okay, everybody wants a swimming pool. You've no idea. In the European Union, everybody wants a swimming pool. We didn't pay for swimming pools. We wouldn't pay for sports facilities and so on. So we had a number of rules which were set up and protected us to a certain extent. But if you don't have those rules, you've got to somehow be like a boxer who rides with the punch. You've got to take the punishment and extract the maximum benefit that you can from it. And the benefit that we always looked to extract was that we had clearly defined rules about how the money should be used, and we would then try to force it through the programs. So a parliamentarian in the European Union who comes with a project, he has to try to go through a program. And the parliamentarian here who comes with a project should be made to go through the program. And the mere, okay, he still gets, or she still gets the project, but the program is strengthened by the fact that the project becomes a part of the effort. So the program could say, for example, what are you hoping to achieve with this project? The program could ask, do we have people in our area who are skilled in the construction of this project? Do we have people in this area who are skilled in the maintenance and the operation of this project? And by asking these questions, you can actually tie other things onto the project. I think I told you the last time I was in South Africa, they were making a huge gas pipeline, but they didn't ask themselves the right sort of questions at the beginning. So they didn't have anyone in South Africa. They didn't have the South African unemployment rate is about 20% among normal workers, with another 30% on top for people who will never get a job because they were trained under a very disgraceful education system. But they didn't have enough people to weld the pipes together. They had to import people from Mozambique. So here you had an economy which was suffering huge unemployment, was making an investment, and lost some of the employment benefit because they had no way of, if they'd had a program, if it had been a parliamentarian, for example, who wanted to do this, and they pushed it through the program and the right questions could be asked, then one begins to, so when Natalia, you explain that to me, and I think of you saying, I will go out and fight the lions, and I will protect the strategic fund for regional development against these parliamentarians. I would put my arm around you and take you on one side and say, no, this is like suicide. But there is a way of doing it, and the way of doing it is to first of all make sure that we have a big actions coming up, because that will restrict the amount of money which is available for parliamentarians, or at least create competition, create a reason. Mrs. So-and-so, I'd love to make your internal ski slope, but unfortunately I've got all of these very good projects coming from the local area, and I promised them the money. I only have half of the money I need for your skis. It's much more convincing than having all of the money and saying, we don't believe in ski slopes.
It's just they participate in selection panels. It's not that they want physical money. They just select and they say they make decisions about the slopes, so to say.
Yeah, but it's go on.
Well, I think first of all, I'm very happy to recognize that at the very beginning of your speech, Graham, you mentioned about this theory versus practice dimension of work, because our project or our operation as part of ULI is regional development in policy and action. So this, not controversial, but this phenomenon of diverging lines has been recognized by us, as you might remember, when we were preparing this project, because we know that the new paradigm for state regional policy, new state regional policy of Ukraine, was developed. I mean, the patterns have been developed, but now they need implementation. So this is what we're doing, and something is more successful, something probably is less successful, not on our part, but overall in the country. But this is a line we should continue. And regarding the State Fund for Regional Development, it should be protected, I fully agree, and defended, if you want. But we should remember, all of us, that State Fund for Regional Development is just a part of the new system, one of the elements. And we need to make sure that the whole system operates the way it's been designed. We should be defending and promoting the whole system. The state strategy for regional development, the regional strategies, oblast strategies, implementation plans, and only then, because this is the key source of funding for the implementation of the state regional policy. And its size should be increased. So when just dealing with the State Fund for Regional Development, like a separate element of the whole system, I mean, your question was what we should do about it. It's probably, many things could be feasible, but the only right approach, in my humble opinion, would be to deal with the whole system, to promote it, to protect it, and to make sure all other elements are operating well. Then, and the State Fund for Regional Development, with all those problematic issues you mentioned are correct, then we would have some chance for eventual success.
To come back, so these parliamentarians are in the. Let me tell you how we try to protect ourselves, or not to protect ourselves, but to try to balance this. So our programs, Yuri will and Sergei will correct me, and Matthias will correct me if I'm saying something stupid about Ukraine. But we had all of our programs, so we would have managed by a group of, let's call them strategic partners or strategic actors. Now, in our regions, the committees that brought these people together would be chaired by the central government, often. In some places they would be chaired by the region, but there are some member states where they're too small to have regions, or there are some member states like the United Kingdom, soon not to be a member state, where they didn't have a regional composition. Now, the committee would bring together the principal local government actors, but it might not be all of the local government areas represented, but there would be people from local government. There would be people from NGOs who are interested. There would be people, other actors. We had a major battle with the Federal Republic about the inclusion of trades unions. The Federal Republic didn't want to include trades unions, but we had this argument. But we would have this group. And then the second thing that we would have would be a set of procedures that were triggered when a project was being suggested. So the first thing would obviously be to confront the project by a number of selection criteria. So I can give you one which is not necessarily applicable in this case, but because we were bringing European Union money to what was taking place inside member states, we wanted to make sure that our money did not displace someone else's money, that they had 100 to spend on the project. We came along and said, well, here's 20. And instead of us getting 120's worth of action, they took their 20 away and we were still back down. This was called additionality. We wanted. So our first criteria was, will this project be additional to what would otherwise take place? And sometimes, and if the answer to that question was no, then the project couldn't be accepted. And there were a number of these yes-no questions, which I could look out. And then there were a number of procedures about to try to make sure that there was some kind of benefit in terms of the number of jobs or the types of jobs created according to the expenditure on the project. So you would be able to assess the desirability of different projects. You'd be able to compare them. You'd be able to say, oh, this project costs 100. It will employ 30 women, which was one priority group. It will employ 10 young people and 30 other people. So that's sort of 70 people will be employed in it. And this one will only employ 50 people. And the cost of this project is the same as this one. So we choose this one. We would give them points. They would get, I mean, it sounds childish, like some sort of game in a class, but they would get points. And these committees would then choose the ones that got the highest points. Now, if the one from the parliamentarian gets the highest points, well, okay, let's assume it will always get the highest points because the parliamentarian will say it must. But it's gone through the system. It doesn't go forward as a project which was the idea of Mrs. X because she thought this was good for some other person. It goes forward as a project which will deliver a certain number of benefits, have a certain number of characteristics which make it fit into what we're trying to do. So one couldn't stop. We found that we couldn't stop these things, but we could try to capture them. We could sort of, we could try to make them less disruptive of what we were trying to do. And slowly, it makes a change. In the end, the parliamentarians, when they come forward with their projects, they already begin to anticipate that they have to do a certain number of things. They become more critical themselves in what they pick up to support. So I could ask some of my former colleagues to give me details on different patterns of selection criteria, different procedures, and I can give them here, and then we could try to send you a note which explains how that takes place. But my overwhelming thought is, please don't think that anyone can stand against. When there's unused money, you die. You can't keep people away from it. You just cannot keep people away from it. The fact that I'm alive still shows you that I learned that lesson quite early in my career. Right.
Maybe ask your colleagues to say something. What is your opinion? Because you're working with this fund.
We are not working with this fund, actually.
I mean, you
we want to, but we don't.
But you know this system. Would you like to say something? Because it's extremely interesting for us to know your opinion. Because we are brainstorming, we are experts, but
we do have those criteria as Graham mentioned. We do have the system of evaluation. We have these political problems. We are talking now here more about politics, more than policy, and it is the way of this confronting Parliament, and I agree here with you, Graham, that it is no way to win this battle. And that is it. So they vote for this 1% or not 1%. They aren't commissions. So we do have the rules and criteria for now for them to evaluate this project in a proper way and to finance in a proper way. And we just have a lack of political will, if you want to, we can say that way. And what we can do, and I think from your side, what you can do, is to give a little bit political pressure. Not procedural ones. We can issue new decrees, we can draft new laws, but it won't help. That's the point.
But do you think, in terms of this selection criteria, what Graham was explaining to us, is there any chance that we can make this selection criteria more strict to limit the influence of parliamentarians somehow by amending the decree? This is just
but selection criteria are not directly linked to
parliamentarians are not participating in the selection of projects. Projects are selected at the regional level according to the criteria which Stanislav just mentioned.
Yeah.
The thing is that parliamentarians are, in 2019, they put in the law entitlement to somehow submit these projects from them as physical persons, basically.
Oh, sorry then.
That is the problem for 19. And the bigger problem, where I think Graham was talking about European politicians in a different way, because in Ukraine we have a situation when the parliamentarians decide the laws, they vote the laws, and they also participate in the executive branch of power. So they may not be in both seats here. They either produce laws, they either vote for the laws, and then supervise, how do you call this, parliamentary nadzor.
It's oversight.
Oversight the implementation of the laws as parliamentarians. That's what parliamentarians do. This is the division of the legislative and executive branches. In Ukraine, they have taken the role of executive branch as well. So we have a situation of conflict of interest, a clear conflict of interest, and it has to be solved at the level of the Constitutional Court. Nobody else can rule this out, I think, in our situation.
But that leaves, let's say, two questions. Number one is, would it be possible to somehow find a way so that the projects introduced by the parliamentarians, they still have the power to introduce the projects, but they don't do it directly to Min Region, they do it through the region that they want.
That's what the ministry has now developed a regulation in 2019 that the parliamentarians have to go through, just like you said, through the system to be able to submit this project. They don't do it directly. They have to go in the region, but still there is a political pressure from their side. I am the parliamentarian of your region. Here is my project. It comes from my constituency, by the way. And here it is. Commission, please make your unbiased decision on which project, according to very strict criteria, which project is better.
No, I understand.
There is a political pressure.
No, I understand. But then the second suggestion is to somehow work intensively in the rest of the region to make sure that there's a crowd of projects that so imagine that we were running a program and we have one call for projects every 4 months, or we operate a sort of an open guichet system so that if you have a project, you can bring it forward and we'll look at it. So imagine that we're doing that. There comes a moment in the year when the parliamentarian comes forward with his project, and needs X, but we've only got sort of 0.2x left in our kitty. Now, he gets the other 0.2 we've finished, but we managed to get 0.8 simply because we were there sort of operating
and this is what happened this year, actually. The problem is not that bad in terms of parliamentarians submitting their projects. Why? Because there are projects from previous years which still have to be funded. And now that 50% of the funds are going for the implementation of regional strategies at the regional level. So basically what happens is that there practically are no new projects that will be selected this year. Coming from whoever, from parliamentarians or from municipalities, it doesn't matter. Because there are projects that were already contracted last year. And another 50% of the allocation for this year, the priorities for this have to be decided by the government, and there has to be some special procedure on how to submit the projects for these priorities, for the other 50% priorities. And this is not really clear what will be this year. But we hope that 2019 is an exclusion, is just a political year with all the elections, because in the legislation it says, as an exclusion, in 2019, we have this and this and this and this. But if the new members of parliament come, and as you say, their appetites only grow, they will be fresh and happy to get some money back from their campaigns. They spend on the campaign by all means they can have. So they will be inclined to even make these norms, I don't think worse, maybe even worse, but at least they will be inclined to keep them for the next years. This is very, very likely. So I think that the EU could really put some pressure, political pressure, in terms of principles. Guys, the division of power has to be followed. You may not vote on the allocation of the budget and then also participate in the distribution. It's clear conflict of interest. So some principles have to be identified against which the high leadership of EU actually talk to the parliament and committees and fractions and basically explain this to them in this way, and also connect this to the development assistance. If you don't fix this, I don't see any other ways of influencing this terrible situation.
Yeah, maybe with the exception of some pressure on the part of the civil society. Yuri has recently sent us a link of this Opora analysis on how the subvention, so-called subvention for social economic development of regions or individual territories, just how it's being implemented. So the text is great in terms of giving a very clear picture, including some technical details, how the whole system is, to what extent the whole system is, kind of rotten, and what should be done to adjust it. And I think I fully agree with what Yuri has said regarding the pressure that should be considered or advised, let's put it this way, to have political dialogue with the European Union. And if, say, Commissioner Hahn or somebody else comes to here, or our people visit Brussels, then these messages should be communicated. But supporting civil society organizations in Ukraine, which have expertise, understanding and political will to turn the situation around, could be also of great help. Could be very helpful on the part of the European Union. So that democracy and common sense, they die in darkness. So these things should be brought on the surface. Society should be more or less aware about them. It might sound a little bit kind of romantic under the conditions when we have witnessed the abolition, the recent decision by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, for example. But still, this is one of the ways, and it will continue to be.
It's also, we will discuss it with Graham separately, because it's all about the mandate of the European Commission and the responsibilities of high-level representatives of the Commission, because in Ukraine we have so many problems that if they start pushing on each, we understand that this is important, but they also have their limitations and what they can push for.
Natalia, that's exactly what my reaction is. That come on, fellas. Ukraine is a sovereign state. It's a grown-up. It subscribes to the gas company. It pays its rent. It's an adult. Ukraine left home long ago and is making its own way in the world. And you can't expect. It's not good for the European Union to keep going off and saying, a number of people have come and complained to us. Can you do this? I just don't think that's good karma. I think that I can understand. So in listening to Yuri, I had two reactions. Number one, I've lived through this business about you have a backlog, and it helps or not helps, but it helps in this particular case. Because the problem comes, as you said later, with once the backlog is gone, you're back to sort of low water insofar as projects are concerned, and more spare money. And then, as you say, you've got new parliamentarians who are extremely keen. And I think that what the union can do, because this is at a much, as it were, lower level, is to always try to make sure that all projects to be financed through regional policy go through the proper procedures. And I realise that's only lightweight, but the more you can stimulate other people to come forward with proposals and with proposed projects, and the more you can smoothly adopt those projects without leaving a mass of money on one side ready for a parliamentarian when they might come, then the more you begin to tame the problem. And the other thing is, and this is just a last thought, going back to our internally displaced people difficulties, the things that were necessary for internally displaced people were often good for regional development. I mean, just because we didn't have the idea doesn't mean to say that it wasn't helpful. So a lot of things can be made helpful to regional development. That's what I was trying to say. So even if a parliamentarian comes forward with a project and everybody says, oh, it's a parliamentarian and we're just having to approve, not all of these projects are bad. Some will be bad, but not all. And it's a question of, as I say, trying to capture them as far as you can and making sure that they put on the same clothes as other projects, that they're managed in the same way. I can see that Yuri feels that that's difficult.
That would be a very ideal situation if they came in the same clothes and submitted their project just like everybody else.
Well, what I'm saying is that I don't think you can get there immediately. That's the best. I think you just have to live with the good for a while and do the best you can. And in the end, it will all work out. You're always, perhaps it's a part of the Ukrainian nature, which I'm unaware of, but you're all incredibly impatient. You don't.
You won't say this. The EU has inspired this policy in Ukraine. There was no regional policy in the EU way before. It was very manually managed. It was politically managed. The funds that were available based on the political support. Yeah. So Donetsk would get more, Crimea would get more, and then Lviv would get more, or Ivano-Frankivsk would get more. It's totally wrong principle of distribution of development money, let's say, if we're talking about public support for public investments for development. Yes? So this new regional policy was inspired a lot by EU practices, by EU principles in 2008-9 when it was designed. And then now it is shaping up as Ukraine's policy already. But everybody is calling this, we have taken this from EU, and it's based on EU best practice, what we are doing now. And so my message is that, look guys, it's very nicely shaped policy, but you are not delivering it the way EU is delivering this policy. And who has to say this, if not EU, who can evaluate that it is based on EU principles and good practice or not? It should be EU who should say this, because now politicians are actually gaining points and doing all these bad things with the EU flag. You know, we are doing just like EU. Okay, so we will distribute 100% of the state money. EU is doing the same. They are actually, spoiling the image of it, and they are lying to everybody about this. So who has to tell them about the fact that they are lying and that they are misusing it?
And regarding impatience,
it's better that I die doing that than Natalia dies doing that.
Right. Regarding impatience, we have always been saying in recent years, guys, Ukrainians, you do not have time. Time is short.
It is. Yeah.
I'm not saying we should be jumping at some conclusions, but indeed, nobody's impatient.
Since 2008-9, when this was all already developed in paper, we are only starting to implement it now, and it is going in the wrong direction. And someone has, we cannot just say that, guys, it's going in the wrong direction. Someone has to do this. Someone. And that's why I think it's EU. This budget support was meant to do this. There are 7 indicators. If you don't follow these indicators, you don't get the money. But also, there is a political level consultation where we tell you guys that it's not the case. It's not in line with indicators which were developed based on good practice, on EU good practice. So it's very sensitive.
No. I'm fine. I'm absolutely fine.
Ukraine is doing its homework in a way, right?
Yeah, good.
I should shut up here, but anyway,
when I said, it's true that I've said that you don't have time, and anybody who wants a job must have the job as quickly as possible. And when we're talking about improving people's living quality, we ought to be energetic. I just repeat something I said to Peter Wagner in January. I said, look, you take Romania, we've put piles of money into Romania, piles, masses of technical assistance, and look at the mess. You take Hungary, we put piles of money into Hungary, and look at the mess. You take Poland, we put bigger piles of money into Poland, and look at Poland's ingratitude, because they're incredibly right. And then I said, and Peter said, yeah. And I said, so what about Ukraine? If it's taking us so long in Romania, in Hungary, in Poland, where we're putting in masses of aid, what's our time frame for Ukraine? I mean, because the commissioner is extremely impatient. It's a bit like him. Okay, so Peter thought for a while and said, it'll take a generation. Now, I think it'll take more than a generation to fully professionalize, modernize. Of course it will. But I was quite happy that at least Peter looks at what we're trying to do in generational terms and not in terms of we have to do it within 2 years before the end of ULEAD or before the end of the next ULEAD or whatever. So that's why, but I realize I said some terrible things about time before. If you remember, we got this far before we started to talk about the strategic fund, and I was saying that this form of governance, multi-level governance, also had problems. It solves some of our difficulties, but not others. And that leads us to the idea that decentralization, multi-level governance, they are structures of governance. But what's really important is the way, or what is also important, is the way in which governance is carried out through these structures. And so I thought that I would try to invent 5 points which I could communicate to you as fellow administrators, to 5 points which indicate the quality of governance. So the first, and I'm going to do this quickly, if I can make this work. How do I do this? How do I do this? I've gone back to the beginning.
What do you need to do?
I want to go
Next.
Okay, keep going. Oh, No, there we are. No, go back. I said I would do it quickly. Right. Yeah. So the first can you go back one more? No, back. No. No. Go. No. No. Go back one.
That one probably, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. Where is this? F-Bed? What is this? It's an ASUS. How is F-Bed working? Yeah, holy crap.
Hey, wait.
Oh, come on. Okay, so we want this, right? We want this.
Yeah.
And then it's something here.
Okay, so the first point is to try to get over to you the idea that you're operating inside a large policy community. You tend to think that the policy community is you and your colleagues in the centre, but no, it isn't, is it? It reaches right down to the citizens on the ground. So if you think about the policies I mentioned at the beginning, health, let's start with health. The policy community for health is gigantic. It's huge. It includes, obviously, all sorts of civil servants, but it includes hospital administrators, doctors, nurses, hospital cleaners, and so on. They're all part of the policy community. If you think about education in the policy community, there are teachers, professors, technicians, researchers, and so on. These are all part of the policy community. And in your policy community for regional and local development, you don't only have your colleagues in the centre, but you have all of the people in the different layers of government, but you also have people who come forward with projects, you have people who are working in NGOs, you have a very large community. And when we were talking earlier, I was saying that this community should somehow be represented in the groups which choose projects. So the first thing is you have to be aware, in my view, or it's helpful to be aware that we're part of a large policy community. And the second thing is, we want this community to support the policy. We want this community to be united with a consensus which says that this policy is a good thing. And that means bringing citizens to see the benefits that they get from the policy. And it means that the policy must operate fairly so that they have confidence, citizens have confidence that it's helping them to build their future. And in order that this consensus can form and protect the policy from all sorts of harm, it needs to be strengthened by communication. And the communication needs to have certain characteristics. It needs to be comprehensive, active, understandable, blah, blah. But it also needs to be a two-way street. It's not this top-down business where you tell everybody what they have to do. You have to be able to take in from the level of Hramadas also all of the information you can. And if you think about the fact that you're in Kiev, I told you when we were looking at that earlier slide, our difficulty in Brussels, when we had this more decentralized system, this multi-level government system, was to try to make sure that the people at the level of localities were doing what we were trying to get them to do. If you think about it in Kiev, you're doing exactly the same thing. You're trying to pass your messages down, and you want people in Hramadas, no matter where they are, to take more or less the same decisions on more or less the same set of facts and in more or less the same way. You want a certain commonality in the policy. You want the policy to be the same, more or less, in the east as in the west and in the north and the south. And that shows you the sort of task that you're trying to achieve through the communication, to maintain this supportive consensus. And the thing that you're trying to communicate is knowledge. Knowledge about the policy. What is the policy's objective? What are you trying to achieve? When are you trying to achieve it? Why have you chosen that the policy should operate in this particular way? What evidence do you have that this is working? And all this kind of knowledge needs to be passed out through your communication system. And we all need to understand that if we can't explain simply the policy that we're operating, and it can't be easily understood by all of these people in the perhaps tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of people in the policy community. If you can't do it, if you can't explain it simply, if they can't understand it easily, then the policy will not work. The policy cannot work. The policy cannot work from just the centre. It can only work on the ground. So for me, that's an iron law. If you can't explain things simply, if people can't understand what you're trying to do, then the policy will always be at risk, and it cannot be satisfactorily implemented. Now we come to my favourite topic, which is bureaucracy. Now, I don't know whether it's the same in Ukraine, but in the English language world, if you say I'm a bureaucrat, people think that you're sort of mentally deficient, because this is what bureaucrats are. Okay, bureaucrats never do things simply, they never do things quickly, they fill in forms, they understand nothing. But in fact...
Is it a compliment, Graham, or just an observation?
It's an observation. In my case, it's more or less accurate, but in your case, it isn't. You have to give a huge amount of attention to perfecting the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy needs to be simple, transparent, rapid. It needs to be open to scrutiny. It needs to be accessible so that people who want to access the programs can do so. It needs to be proportionate so that if I'm coming to the program for 100,000 hryvnia, I don't have to do the same as someone who's coming for 10 million hryvnia or something of this sort. And the important thing to have in mind always is that it's through your bureaucracy that the citizens meet your policy. They don't, that's the point of contact. The point of contact is not ministerial speeches and things of this sort. The point of contact is that someone who has a need, comes to the program, asks for help, fills in a form or whatever, and if they don't get a response, then they will form the view that the policy is ineffective. So then the next thing is evaluation. You know what you're trying to do because you set an objective. You need to know what you have done. And evaluation is delicate in the sense that when we evaluate our own policies, we're marking our own homework. Okay? And obviously, when I mark my own homework, I always gave myself sort of a good mark. So you redo, evaluation is the policy's friend in a certain sense, and it has to be done regularly and has to be done properly. And the question that you're trying to answer through evaluation is how can the policy be improved? Now, in my experience, politicians don't ask that question. They don't. Politicians have an uneasy relationship with evaluation. They tend to make decisions, and then somebody says, well, why? Good question. I'll carry out an evaluation. And if I've decided to do something, my evaluation will tell me that this is the thing I ought to do. And if I've decided not to do something, then the evaluation will tell me what I ought not to do. But That's okay for a politician, but it's not all right for you, because you need to know how things are working and how, where things stand. So you need to make sure that you have sort of regular evaluations, and of course, if you have evaluation, you have to incorporate its results. It's a very strange thing. There's a constant reluctance of people to listen to the results of evaluation. You go to people you evaluate someone for the second time, and the first question is, have you put into effect the results of the first evaluation? Oh, no. No, it's often not the case. Even here, I've come across exactly the same tendency. I've tried to fight against it. So, evaluation is important. It can take place at any time in the policy or program process. We can even evaluate our delivery system before we begin. And then the last point is the 5 points I want to leave with you. That policy operates within a policy community which is large. It's essential that this community supports your policy with a supporting consensus. You can only build the consensus through communication, passing over knowledge, so that your consensus, so that your community is unified. Bureaucracy is the place where your policy meets the citizens, and evaluation is the road to policy improvement. There. I did it really quickly.
Your question?
Yeah.
I don't understand what you mean by policy community. Is it civil society, bureaucracy, or politicians, or everything together?
If you think about regional development in Ukraine, think about all of the people who must do something in order that your policy actually reaches citizens on the ground.
So this is the people who implement the policy.
Yeah, but I've tried to give you the impression that you're a part of the implementation just as much as they are. So the people who that's why I call it a community, because I don't want to sort of present some kind of hierarchy of worthiness. Often you hear people say, my policy is not working because people on the ground don't understand how to apply it. Okay, that's frequent. And I don't find that's not sensible. Just like thinking that you can hold out parliamentarians is not sensible. We're part of a community, and our job is to try to make sure that we all operate in the same way. So here in Kiev we have an idea, it's transmitted to an oblast or to a hromada. The hromada tries to transmit this to people who might be thinking about projects or to people who want to get training. And all of these people become part of your policy community. And the more they all understand that they're in your community, the more they will be prepared to support what you do. The most stunning example of this I can offer you at the moment is Brexit, is Britain leaving the European Union. For 40 years, the United Kingdom government didn't take the trouble to tell people in the United Kingdom that they were part of the European Union and that they were benefiting from European Union policies. They didn't try, that they would never fly the European Union flag. People in the United Kingdom don't know that the European Union has an anthem. All this sort of stuff. And then at the end of the day, suddenly the government discovers that it's lost its supportive consensus for a thing as big as that. So if it can happen for a thing as gigantic as, in effect, a part of the country's constitution, imagine how much more easily it can happen to parts of your own policy. So you have to constantly work to keep your policy community efficient and informed. No? You don't agree?
No.
How would you do it then?
No, I don't really understand what you mean.
You don't understand?
I understand the language, but not the
sense. It takes time.
Wait a minute. Let's just think of the army. Okay, I've never really served in the army, but I actually admire the army. For many years I didn't admire the army, and then I realized that the army does very complex tasks, and it breaks it down. So somebody at the top of the army decides that they will invade Venezuela.
This is normally a political decision, not the army.
Okay. And then somebody at some point drives a lorry into a town in Venezuela and takes over the local radio station, let's say. So how is it that the person who takes over the local radio station knows that that's what they've got to do? Because they've never been to, let's say, Washington and talked in the Pentagon about exactly what their task will be in this great enterprise. But the guy in the lorry or the woman in the lorry realizes that they're part of this particular military community, and coming down through this huge structure is the information which is necessary, the knowledge which is necessary to make sure that everybody does the right thing.
Okay, I think I got it.
I'm
Drastic example, but
I'm always amazed that I thought, quite frankly, for many, many years that soldiers were silly, stupid. Because I thought that if you go and put your life in somebody else's hands, that's basically not a sensible decision. I'm sorry that I've changed my mind now, and I've realized, in fact, that military command is like the most efficient bureaucracy you can discover. So it's not a bad model to keep in mind.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. Everybody's weary. We don't have to stay if you want to go.
any more questions, ideas, suggestions, thoughts? Вопросы можно задавать на любом языке.
Кроме твоего родного языка.
Так кто сможет, ради бога.
Да, кстати, это правильно. Graham, do I understand correctly that when talking about evaluation, one of the key challenges would be to identify the correct linkages between your policy, your own policy, and those all kinds of different indicators that could exist in theory, right? Because normally this is very difficult to to separate. I mean, what's the right word?
We could talk for an hour about indicators. I have...
no, I mean, not indicators, but what you were saying. Like, if this is a policy, and then you come to the point when you start evaluating this policy, and then you are kind of lost, because you're not sure to what extent your policy has impacted this or that indicator or sector. Or it could have been somebody else's policy. Could you...
The first, I find the first difficulty in trying to define regional and economic development is that if you define it like I did, trying to bring benefits to citizens, it's quite obvious that, and you try to define these benefits in terms of a better life quality, then all policies are aiming to do the same thing. And so, why is it that regional development policy is concerned, for example, as it is in the European Union, with vocational training? Why isn't that done by education policy? Or why is it that regional development policy in the European Union is sometimes concerned with education? Surely that should be the problem of education policy. And I mean, we could talk about it. My feeling about regional and economic development to a certain extent is that it has a very special job with citizens because it connects the dots. It is a way in which citizens can make sure that they benefit from their education, for example. In my case, I left school at 16, believe it or not. I'm sure you can believe it. And I managed to complete my education in other ways. And I find that regional and local development provides ways in which people could complete their education or get more healthy, get more fit, find a job, progress in the job, increase their income and so on. All of the other policies are trying to do that in one way or another, trying to improve quality of life. But I've always felt this rather special task that we connect the dots, we fill the gaps. Then when you come to evaluate, well, yeah, you're right. When you evaluate regional development policy, you're evaluating the effort perhaps of all policies. You can't actually isolate necessarily the benefits that you've created. But I don't think that's important, as long as we're not in that position which I showed you on the picture, where there's a certain amount of implementation going on, but it isn't the policy which is being implemented. As long as some of the things that we're trying to do are connecting with the ground, then it strikes me that things are okay. And then we come to what we could talk for hours about: indicator mania. And here again, I'm very divided. We discovered, for example, that so you need indicators, you need targets, you need indicators, because if you don't, people don't actually all go in the same direction. So if we were the army, for example, we all want to march in more or less the same direction, and the targets and the indicators help us to do this. But indicators have generic weaknesses. Indicators concern themselves with things that you can measure, and often some of the benefits that you're looking for are things that you cannot measure, or you can only measure with difficulty. That's the first point. The second point is that indicators tend to sometimes deform the way the policy operates. I can give you an example. In the United Kingdom, they set targets and indicators for education. And they compare schools they compare one school with another according to how they meet these targets. So I'm a teacher. You're my class. I'm going to be judged on the number of people in this class who attain, let's say, level 4. And I look around the class and I can see down there in the back corner there are 3 people who are probably at level 7, and they're going to be quite difficult to advance. Here there's somebody at level 5. If I ignore those people at the end and concentrate on you, I will improve my performance. Or if it's the number of people who pass an exam, by just concentrating on passing the exam, not necessarily educating you, but by teaching you how to pass this particular exam, I will protect my job. And I consider that to be the deformation of policy. I don't think that is the policy. The policy is not intended to leave out some children or to deform the process of education. And sometimes you see that indicators do this. They direct you to things that are measurable, and they produce a behaviour which is not necessarily the best behaviour for what you're trying to achieve for the policy. So, as I say, we could talk for an hour about evaluation, but so my feeling has always been that one needs a certain sort of ability to stand back and actually ask more general questions than can sometimes be represented in particular indicators. The other point, of course, is that if we take the European Union, but if we take Ukraine, it'll be exactly the same. There are some parts of Ukraine where creating 1,000 jobs would be much more difficult than in other parts of Ukraine. So if we all got the task to go out and create 1,000 jobs, we would either operate here in Kiev, because that's probably going to be easiest, or we would go to somewhere like Lviv, because that might be easy as well. But where we wouldn't go is probably where we ought to go. We ought to go to the areas where it's more difficult to create the jobs. So you come out with these indicators and these targets and so on, but they're set from the top. I'm sorry to go back to that, but they're set here in the centre. But they don't take into account the difficulty of actually meeting these targets. I resisted this for quite a long time in Brussels. I had to give way in the end. But I felt that in my particular case, to create 1,000 jobs in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern was much more difficult than creating 1,000 jobs in Berlin. And yet, I was being told to do the same in both, and you think this is wrong. There should be some way that we can weight the difficulty. We have to understand that parts of our community, to go back, some of our soldiers, as it were, they are in much more difficult circumstances than others. So evaluation is a very special area. The choice of indicators is very sensitive, and it's a little bit like measuring GDP. You know, when you're measuring GDP, you don't measure the work of people who stay home, for example. You don't measure anything that isn't monetized. But what's monetized doesn't measure work. There's much more going on than is monetized, and it's the same in our work in regional and local development. One last sentence. We would have schemes to try to get people into work, and one of the big measures would be how many of these people are still in work after 2 years. Okay, it's a good measure. But what we didn't measure, but what was equally important, is that there were a number of people who'd been in work for less than 2 years, but whose lives had been changed by the fact that after a long period of unemployment, they'd had a period working. They'd got closer to regular employment. There was like a psychological change. The people felt that they were in the community again. They weren't being sort of marginalised. It's much more difficult to find a job for someone who's coming out of a centre for drug addicts, for example, or out of prison, than it is to find a job for someone coming out of university. And yet, they're all jobs. And there has to be a way, in my view, in evaluation to measure these things. Because if not, you're minimising the effects of your efforts of the policy. You need to look at it. You need to know whether prisoners are finding work, or whether people coming out of drug addiction centres are finding work, or whatever. You need to know these things because you may be able to construct particular measures to help in these particular areas. But don't let's believe that a job for one person is just equal to a job for another person, because it isn't. A job in one area, one region, is not the same as a job in another region, necessarily. A job in one sector is not the same as... We're dealing with something which varies very considerably. So evaluation is... Be careful. You must do it, but you must always try to make sure that it's done intelligently and not mechanically. Right, it's time to go. 3 minutes from then, right. I hope you don't have to go back to the office today. You don't go back to the office.
We have to. But still, you've got this tons of indicators and evaluating one job for another one in one sector, another one. We still haven't invented somehow centered indicator, let it call the Big Mac index for regional development. We don't have it. I think EU also don't have it.
No.
Oh, so.
But
Just please don't mix indices with.
No, it wasn't. No. It was just. Yeah, no. It was just for an example, just an analogy. I understand it's different things. But the point was about this jobs and the evaluation of this like gross weight of one job and gross weight of another job. And what about communication and creating the community? Is it about the one side is like training and information and communication, and the other side is involvement? The other side of the road. This is one point. And the second point is about involving the other equal actors of the policy of different sectors, other ministries, into this shaping and implementing the regional policy. How do you deal with it?
so we would try to, the last part first, we would try to make sure that other relevant ministries were somehow represented in the groups which chose the projects. Okay? So we didn't do that at the centre. We did that on the ground. We did that close to the citizens.
Mm-hmm.
So we would, sometimes this input would be provided by NGOs, sometimes by ministerial representatives. So in all of our committees there would be someone from the central government, let's say economic development area, and somebody from the central government training and education area. That was more our standard. So then I took it. Some of the training can be, let's say, practical training. I don't know whether this is what it was in your mind. Some of it is theoretical training. And what we would try to do in some of our more, and we only managed this some of the time, I don't really think that we did this all of the time, but we would look for ways in which we could wrap different things into the same instrument. So, for example, in the city of Glasgow, we had a scheme to try to train long-term unemployed people, so people who've been out of work for 2 years or more, in the trades of the construction industry. Okay, building, carpentry, and so on. So we had this training scheme. These people would be recruited to the scheme and they would receive theoretical training. Obviously, there's a certain amount of practical. Then, as part of the scheme, we had as practical training, but still training, they would work in an organised way to improve the local social housing stock. Okay? So they would go to places where housing was being provided on a subsidised basis, and they would perhaps improve the insulation of the building so that the energy conservation was there. They would do some building, they would rebuild garden walls, they would make new doors, or whatever had to be done. So out of this particular scheme, we got a certain number of people who were trained and went back into work. That was one way of measuring our success. We got an improvement in the housing stock, which was more difficult to measure, but That was part of it. And we got a sort of an odd community benefit, because people who'd been on the margin of society because they were long-term unemployed did things in people's homes and came into contact with other people, and the community was sort of strengthened as a result of it. What could we measure? We could measure the number of people trained who went into work, and so on and so on and so on. It's much more difficult to measure the other stuff. But this is what I was meaning when earlier we were talking about Natalia and the parliamentarians coming forward with their projects and so on. There's a way of taking a project, an idea, and wrapping other things into it and changing its nature. So you start off with the idea, well, let's train some unemployed people so they get a job. Fine. You then say, let's make it difficult, let's train long-term unemployed people who have not worked for a long time, got out of the habit of working. Then you say, let's provide some practical training so that they leave a lasting improvement somewhere. And this simple idea of training unemployed people to get work brings these extra benefits. And in my view, part of the loss when parliamentarians come forward with a project is that they say, this is my project, and they put it on the table, and you have to do it. If you are in a system where you can say, well, look, if we do that this way, we get these extra benefits, or the community gets the extra benefits. If we build this, if we use local labour, we shall be putting purchasing power into this economy and so on. It's hugely important, I find, to try to be imaginative in the way that we carry out projects. I think I told you that I have a number of rules of finance, which if you want we can talk about one at a time. But one of them is that imagination is a substitute for finance. If you think, oh, I need some money to train these people, I need some money to improve this housing stock, and if you somehow put the two together, for the cost of training the people, you get the improved housing stock. So you've actually you've spun the dollar an extra time. It goes, and if you do it in a local community, then somebody else gets a benefit, and so on. We're looking all the time to sort of maximise the number of beneficiaries for what we spend. I told you that in South Africa, where they were laying this pipeline, local women, because obviously it's very, very long, and the workers travel over a huge area, and they're often in the middle of nowhere. But local women would carry out food, and they formed, these women would run sort of movable cafes, so that as the pipeline advanced, the women would advance with their cafe. And it brought a benefit. It wasn't the contractor flying in food in packs from Johannesburg, it was local people who were benefiting the local economy. So you can, and somehow this is the culture that we have to try to create even in the smallest hromada in Ukraine. We have to get this idea that it's more than just spending money. It's the way in which we do things which is determinant.
Okay, any more questions? Ladies and gentlemen? Yes.
I would like to ask one question. We are speaking about policy community, policy making process, and it's closely connected with sustainable public management, public governance. Could you tell us what do you mean? What is sustainable public management mean for you? What is it and how it's connected?
It is a state secret, but please tell us. Right.
The first thing is if we go all the way back we leave out parliamentarians and we leave out politics and ideology and so on, The only justification for any policy is that it actually brings benefits to citizens. If it doesn't bring benefits to citizens, we don't need the policy, almost by definition. So a sustainable policy is one, for me, is one which first of all is capable of identifying the needs of the citizens and delivering the required benefits. So like
it's just traditional policy too.
No. Well, it might be traditional policy carried out in a new way, or it might be a new look type policy, which is something carried out in a totally different way. So, for example, in Britain at a certain moment, although they're sort of stepping away from it now, they created in the 1960s, they created a university on the television. So up until that time, if you wanted to get a university degree, you had to go to university. But they created in the 60s this university called the Open University, and at a certain moment in the evening on the television, on one television channel, all of the programs stopped and there were lectures, and you could sign up and do courses on, and people got degrees and went into higher level employment. Now that was a new way of doing but sustainable, for something to be sustainable, in my view, it has to be there's a catch in all of this stuff, isn't there, really? You do something with money, and people say, well, it's not sustainable, because we don't know whether the government will have the money all the time. So the search for sustainable policy is often the search for a policy which has no budget imprint, no budget impact. It's like making the market do the work, which is a great idea, but the trouble with markets is that they don't do the work everywhere. That's why you have a regional development policy. So the markets can do some things, but not all. It does some things in some places, but they. So the idea is, well, if the idea of sustainable policy is that it's one which doesn't need rules and regulations because it's done by the market, or if it doesn't need budget support, then I don't see that any policy worth its name can exist in that way. But on the other hand, if the policy, for me, the policy to be sustainable needs to be accepted. It needs to be seen to be working. It's not so that's why I emphasize the idea of the policy community and the idea of consensus. A policy cannot be sustainable if it's not known, if it's not understood, if it's not practiced, if people don't understand that this is where they get their benefits. Everyone thought in the United Kingdom that European Union membership was sustainable.